Hi, everybody. Uh, Thanks for joining. We're having a little audio difficulties, but we're going to go ahead and start this webinar. The recording for this will be available after the fact. We'll email it out. So in case you fall asleep or miss something, we'll be able to do it. Um, my session today is going to be about 45 minutes. I'll try to keep it short, and we'll have some Q&A time as well. I'm going to talk about e-learning and the rise of e-learning in 2020 and how to localize it. So what we're looking at today is basically why we're here, how to prepare, and also the tools and team development required, and also little unexpected circumstances or consequences that happen along the way, and how to deal with them. So, in case you've not been around or asleep for a few months, we've had a big problem with coronavirus that's happened. And we're going to look at what that actually means in the e-learning landscape and the landscape in general for remote learning and other factors that we're kind of interested in. One person who could basically take a look at this is this guy, Bill Norrie. This came out a couple days ago. He was sailing around the world, and he hit a big wave, and he lost communication, and he'd been out of communication for months. So when he arrived in New Zealand, he had no clue this happened. So think about that for a second. This man had been happily sailing around, had no clue about a pandemic, about shutdowns, about any of the stories. So it was very interesting from his perspective, if you think about it. Another perspective is if you look at this chart, uh, Zoom, which is a virtual conference, I'm sure you're all familiar with, and then on the other side are the airlines. So Southwest, Delta, United, Lufthansa, Air France, all these airlines, if you pile them together, are worth $46 billion. If you look at Zoom, it's worth $48 billion. Now, how'd that happen? Obviously, the travel's been disrupted. Obviously, electronic platforms are coming online. Visual Capitalists is where I got this. It's a very interesting little thing. They have another chart, which is basically the same thing in a timeline. As you can see, the pandemic timeline going on, you can also see the rise and the fall of the airlines. And basically, they all just tumbled down after March. And that's kind of what everyone should be familiar with. April 23rd, it's just worth noting that Zoom had 300 million daily meeting participants. There's Zoom stories almost every day, just about. It's its own type of headline these days. But again, you wouldn't have seen that had you not known, you've been at sea. So this is the rise of e-learning platforms, or is e-communication platforms. Let's call it electronic digital platforms. Another agency that's very interesting to look at is UNESCO. They're kind of involved with education efforts around the world. Quote from their website basically talks about 70% of the world's student population being taken out of classrooms. That's obvious. If anyone here is a parent or knows somebody who's a parent, their children are home. And that's pretty impacting to their lives as well as their educational framework. Looking at the numbers, it's 1.21 billion students. It's basically a pretty big problem for education. So again, this is not commercial education or businesses education. This is learn your arithmetic education or high school or college, but still, it's the same educational milieu. And if you look at this, UNESCO actually has some charts. Again, it's where it's impacted. Basically, it's a global pandemic. We all know that. You have either a localized or countrywide lockdowns, or some places like Greenland are open, which is nice. But if you keep looking, they have guidance, which is actually kind of useful. If you're, again, an educator or a parent, they have really good resources for everything. This whole list is right here. The ones I want to focus, of course, I've highlighted. We have digital learning. We have the massive online course platforms, and then the tools for teachers to learn and educate, create the development of the content. So we're going to focus most on the last part because educational development tools are very important. The stage has been set for e-learning. Um, if you were to look at this, e-learning was set to grow 10% year over year in 2020. This is before billions of people worldwide were kept at home. Uh, if you look at this article from Inc., it basically is talking about IBM did a study, and they found how people are basically not wanting to go back to work. 54% of the workforce says this. So what does that mean? It probably won't be reality as people start getting back to normal, but there's definitely exposure. And so what we're going to find is more companies are moving to e-learning either rapidly by force or by necessity, and also they have to navigate the complex factors in e-learning. And localization, if you're a large enough organization, is part of that puzzle. And LSPs also with their customers have to learn to adapt. Now, for all this to work, we need to understand the tools and the content to manage and deliver it. Businesses as well as institutions are all on this journey to figuring out how to do what they need to do. So let's take a look at this blended learning e-learning experience. First, to do this, you need tools and platform. So what are you going to do to deliver it? How are you going to create it? The skills for the developers have to learn how to make interactive, engaging sessions. Nobody wants to sit through a PowerPoint and just listen. They want to engage. If you're learning something, there's definitely something to be said about gamification or engagement. And finally, the localization aspect of it. What tools do I need to make those other tools work? And how do I go about it? How long does it take? And then also the $100 question is always, how much does it cost? Right. So these three things kind of just create or set the stage for what we need to know. So tools and platforms, we kind of covered a little bit about Zoom and this webinar, this type of thing where you have someone able to broadcast either a daily meeting or some kind of session where you can get your work started. And then finally, you need a blended authoring environment tool. So something like Articulate, it's a pretty large company in the e-learning space. They have two big tools, Storyline and Rise, which I'll go into a little later. Another one called Adobe. They have one called Captivate. Again, more of the same. And Evolve, which is kind of like Rise, and you may not have heard of them. They're rather small, or at least in the namespace, but they're actually used by Google and Facebook. That's kind of the larger players. That's on their press releases, so it's worth looking at them as well. Back to e-learning. What is it about? It's really more like a game. It's also micro-learning, meaning we want to teach you in small chunks of information. We don't want to basically drown you with information. Short interactive things, rapid progress, meaning 20 seconds here, 1 minute there, no more than 2 or 3 minutes of your time ever spent on a task. You get quick results. You get immediate feedback. You're at 20%, you're at 5%. You missed 2 questions out of 10, that type of stuff. And also, when you have these small little tasks that you're completing, the science shows that you actually have more retention. So short interactive games also drive complexity. So we're going to be looking at how things get complicated when you start interleaving these short interactive elements. So one thing to look at is Adobe Captivate. This is basically an interaction from that tool. I've recorded my screen and I captured myself doing it. The audio probably won't come out, so I'm just going to mute it. And I'm just going to play it for a little bit, and I'll tell you what's going on. There's a voiceover. We're talking about a hacker or somebody who we're trying to investigate. And then they're telling me I have this much time to figure out who he is, and I have to narrow the possibilities. Now, all these elements that are coming in are part of the interaction. There's a little bit more here. I'm going to scoot on a little more. We're listening to his phone call, and then I'm being asked to which of these features from the call mattered, and I submitted my interaction, my little quiz, and the number is going to go down, and then it's going to continue, right? So I can zoom in on his laptop. They say, pick what of this is interesting, and I pick something, and then it continues. So this is the interaction. Very, very interesting, very, very much engaging. It keeps going. You can probably sit through this and not feel like you spent too much time. If we look at the backstage of this, this is what it looks like. This is Captivate in the back end. And what you see is you have screen, you have the video that we're watching, you have these little animations that move, you can see where they start and where they end. In the bottom, you have a timeline, all sorts of stuff going on here. And you can see there's slide after slide after slide, and they all kind of work together to create that experience. So what we notice is that we're really accelerating an existing challenge, meaning presenting something just plainly and just saying, here's some pictures and let me talk to it, is good, I guess. If you, again, 45-minute webinar, what I'm doing is perfectly fine. But if you expect someone to sit through a compliance course that's 4 hours or 10 hours long, that's not going to happen. So you need timed audio, you need videos, you need text on the screen, you need animations. Things need to happen. The problem is, if you look at that interaction slide, there's some big gaps because I know what I want, but it's not necessarily what I'm going to deliver or present. And that's where we talk about technical debt. That's when you go to your localization provider and you say, hey, can you make this snap? And they say, sure, we know how to do video. We know how to do some timed audio. We can do that. Problem is putting it all together. And here's another example. Here's Storyline. This is basically, again, I'm just using sample content everywhere. So this is all really basic stuff. But if you see there's a picture, there's titles. Down here, there's a timeline. There's groups of stuff. Over here on the side, there's triggers. So it says when you click on this, this happens, right? The thing pops up and shows you something. So all this is, again, part of the same experience. It's again variations of simplicity and complexity. It's creative. So if you're an instructional designer or a content developer that wants to make something very complicated, you definitely can. Or if you just want to use a simple slide, that's there too. So these variations are what drive the complexity of the tools, which drive debt. So if we go again to the process, if you look at a localization project for e-learning, you end up with a couple things that might be unplanned or just come as a surprise. Translation, that's obvious. It'll cost you money to have someone say this is 20 words or 1,000 words or 10,000 words. The voiceover recording, okay, that makes sense. The desktop publishing, the DTP for layout or image creation. Preparing that script for the voiceover, doing some subtitling if necessary, post-production of the video or video assets or on-screen graphics or anything involved with that animations. Someone has to look at it. Someone has to click on all those tabs, all those buttons, get the wrong answer, get the right answer. These things have to make sense to the user. So QA is a big deal. Accessibility. Now, WCAG is relatively new in the sense it's been out for a while. WCAG is basically providing accessible content on the web, and it's become more or less the de facto standard for communicating to people who have difficulty hearing or seeing or any mixture of the above. It's accessibility. And it's very important in the sense that a lot of companies or even governmental institutions, if you look at them, they say, well, here's my proposal or my brochure for this thing. I have to make it available to everyone who I possibly can. They're either mandated by law or usually mandated by law. So you end up having 50 translations of the voting information because everyone needs to know how to vote or what have you. This spills over to accessibility where it says, I'm not visually capable of reading this. I have really bad eyesight or something. Here's the audio version. Or I can't hear. Here's the subtitle version. And finally, after you combine all these components, all these demands, you need someone to orchestrate it or a project manager, right? This person has to make sure that you capture everything in one and it doesn't spill over or not spill over to the others. These platforms don't really have an export button all the time. So what ends up happening is you think you have something and you don't, or you don't have something. So if you go back to that earlier example of that video, how would you address that? Well, somebody would have to write down the script. Someone would have to write down what it says on the side. Someone would have to write down all the interactions and copy paste them. That is a very expensive or repetitive task, and that's something we have to look at in terms of budgets and QA and how that's going to work. Some platforms have an export button, but it doesn't always work. So this is a little worse than saying, I know I have to do all that. This one says, oh, I thought I had that. And it comes as a surprise. These are elements that are commonly missed in exports, and not just because the buttons didn't work. It's also, did you know there was an embedded file? Did you know we needed captions? I needed voiceover transcriptions. Or again, those WCAG descriptions, audio descriptions are part of that. Or any embedded e-learning in e-learning. Or metadata, like I need the alt tags or the title tags. These things come up, hopefully not at the end of a project, but definitely can come in and derail a project. So if you don't have the translation, you can't do the media, you can't do the recording, you can't put it in the file, you can't deliver it. So all these have a cascading effect. I'm going to talk a little bit precisely about one example on articulate rise. Rise actually is a HTML rich native environment, makes really good presentations very easily. Click and drag, you type, you can create interactions, upload files, videos, very, very engaging to the user, very easy to build. It launched in 2016. They didn't really have localization for 2 whole years almost. And here's the announcement where they say, hey, we now have the ability to do XLIF. And it's a very good thing. Unfortunately, Arabic's still not supported. The solution, of course, is to go to engineering in reverse. What I mean by that is reverse engineering is the sense that you can go backwards from the source, not from the source, rather from the output file. So if you have an output file and you basically want to make sure that it's there, we basically want to see what's going on with that. Reverse engineering allows you to decompile the asset, see what it's made out of, unpack the HTML, that type of activity. It's not your typical localization activity. Typically, you work from the start of the source file, give me the Word document, I'll give you your PDF later. This is the opposite. So it requires a different mindset, and it's worth bearing in mind that this solves a lot of your obstacles. Here's an example for Arabic. Now, it's still not available, not possible to be done in Articulate Rise. Here it is in Articulate Rise. Now, note, it still has the labels on the wrong side, and there's some problems with it. And it's Google Translate, so sorry if I offend anyone with that Arabic. It's pretty bad. But what you can see is that it's possible. Now, the question becomes, is it worth doing? And in some cases, you know what, we'll redo the course enough so that some of these elements aren't that necessary, but it's still available. That's sometimes a decision that people can make versus, sorry, we can't do Arabic. We can't use this platform, which is not a good answer. Other tools and tech. So we're going to talk about other things that come into play along with XLIF and Rise and Articulate and all those other components. And we're going to cover XLIF, the translation interchange format, the ability to subtitle things, transcription, and also text-to-speech. Each of these addresses a different part of that multimedia puzzle and simplifies or helps you. It can also provide other things to think about. So first, XLIF. What is it? Why is there a question mark? And the reason is that you don't always get what you ask for. Here's Captivate. You export captions and closed captions. That's what they call everything, a caption. And it does a Word doc. It still does not do XLIF. Fine. We can live with that. I can work with Word docs. This is Articulate. This is Storyline. This will go ahead and export XLIF, which is really nice. Note, it only tells you the source. So what's the target? I don't know. You figure it out. And that's kind of leads me to my next question is, why am I going to use XLIF if I don't know what I'm doing with it? And then sometimes what you're left with is it's the only option or the best option. Things you'll find out is that they're not always defined properly or appropriately. What's the target language? I got 10. Okay, here's one. I mean, again, these are design questions from the product side, but also when it comes to implementation, you're going to have to deal with this. The other thing is they don't know the language codes, or they have their own, or they have different ones. Again, potential areas of complexity. And then finally, a lot of the HTML, which is pretty or maybe not pretty, but as part of it, is in the XLIF. So then you have to untangle the two. These, again, engineering issues. And then finally, there's the C data. So I call the XML bit bucket. They just throw whatever they want into C data. I don't have to worry about how it's formatted or what it looks like. They just throw it in C data. This is pretty problematic depending on how your system is set up. So again, you're going to look at what's seemingly a simple project, which becomes a complicated, complex technical problem. And this is just XLIF. Now, there is a tool that I want to talk about called Evolve. I mentioned them earlier. I hadn't heard of them actually until recently. And when I stumbled across them, they're very interesting. And the way they're interesting is that, as you can see, this is their web page builder, or whatever you want to call it. It's suitably complicated. It has a lot of stuff that you can add and change, and in a way, this is pretty much like any other tool that you have a lot of widgets and things you can manipulate. But what's very interesting about this is the way they handle XLIF. Is they create a version, but it's a base version of the course. Because as you all know, when you do one thing, you tend to do it again and again as you iterate or correct or change things or what have you. This happens. But what ends up happening is that you don't track your versions appropriately, and you end up with language version of version 1, and then the English version is version 7, and then you have to go back and somehow make sense of that. So this kind of handles it like a CMS. What I mean by that is if you take a look, this is the export XLIF button, and there's course versions and language versions. And not only that, there's source and target. So now we can say, this is my German Liechtenstein. It's actually, they're a little silly on how many options they give you, which is very generous of them, actually. But they have all sorts of language variants, which is actually very healthy. So you end up with lots of language versions, and you can import translation versions and back and forth. So this is what I would say is the ideal state, and it's probably not what you'll see a lot of, and you may not have a lot of people using this platform either, but do know it's out there. There are solutions out there. So if we turn to subtitles, I'm using Smartcat as an example because they're nice enough to help me with a seminar, but it's also another topic that with subtitles, segments are not segments. And what I mean by that is this is a translation of a Portuguese Brazil segment. That first line up here is you can do all these things, and there's returns in there. At the bottom, though, these 4 little lines are when these words appear on the screen. They appear in 4 different segments, but it's actually one segment because it's one sentence. So if you're a translator, you have to keep these 2 things in mind now. One is, this is the phrase or the thing that it means, and then here's how it's going to show up. So I have to make sure that A, it's in between the right timing, it's also in the right meaning, and it's also in the right place. And the next segment is pretty hairy as well. And as you can see, there's some easy ones, some harder ones. But translating subtitles is complicated. Moving on to another tool, which is transcription. Transcription is actually very, very useful in the sense that it lets you capture. Automated transcription tools allow you to capture the audio without having to spend a lot of time or money writing it down. Now, there's a caveat that these tools are automated. It's called ASR, if you want to look them up. There's a couple out there. I'm going to show you Happy Scribe. There's Speechmatics, and there's Rev, and there's a bunch of platforms out there, and they're all equally good in the sense that they have a robust system around them. This is my talk from earlier this month about Loc from Home. I uploaded the recording and into Happy Scribe, and I just basically said, give me some subtitles. They actually released this recently. So it goes straight from audio video to subtitle text. And here's what I was saying. So we end up having to copy paste. It's kind of a previous slide that I was talking about. And at the bottom, you can see where it's timed. You can see the waveform. So you can see when I was making sounds or sounds were being made, not necessarily what they were. There's also a synchronization playback tool, and then a live rendering of it. So highlighting and copying and pasting. And you can see exactly when I said it, what was said, how it was said. Now, this is very useful for a number of features. One, if you just need a subtitle on a presentation or an audio video, you're done, almost. Now, it doesn't always capture everything correctly. So if I mispronounce something, or if I pronounce a word like another word sounds, someone's going to have to listen to it. And obviously that's problematic in the sense that you can't just throw in anything and pull out anything. It kind of works like that, but not really. You need to have someone listen to it. So you still need a transcriptionist or someone who speaks the language and reads the language and knows the difference between bass and bass, or potato, or whatever it is that the sound is not the same. One last piece, there's another tool that you might be interested in is text-to-speech. So text-to-speech is actually relatively new. I mean, it's been around for years, but Amazon, Google, these guys I'm listing here, Facebook, Apple, they all either have a personal digital assistant or something else. and they're all invested in creating voice from written typed things. Now, you all might remember Stephen Hawking. He had this wonderful robotic voice. In fact, he liked it so much, even though when technology moved ahead, he wanted the original. He was sentimental about it. These voices are getting better every day. We're getting neural TTS or advanced artificial intelligence systems. These things are providing much better, richer levels of output. Here's Amazon's version. I've talked a lot about this in the past, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it. But as you can see, you can basically just type in the text, pick a voice, pick a variation of a theme, and then listen to it or download the MP3. So if you're a course designer and you really just need someone to say click next, and either you have laryngitis or you're tired of hearing your own voice, then you can go in here and have this thing do it for you. Now, granted, it's a different task. It's an engineering heavy task because now you have to make sure that you're typing in right, or if it mispronounces something, you can go back and fix it. So again, this is the future in the sense that it is like machine translation for translation, meaning it's not all there, and it'll never replace the translator. This will never replace a voice artist, but it definitely can supplement them. Or if you just need someone to say click next, this will say click next, just like anyone else will. And finally, we can't forget about the QA. I almost did. The QA is really something that brings it all together. Someone has to render this document, preview it, listen to the audio, listen to that text to speech, tell you, hey, you know what? It screwed up this word, or it mispronounced this phrase, or this button doesn't work, or your video doesn't make sense. Why is it talking about red and blue when the text says orange and green? Again, these things are going to happen because you had 6 or 7 different teams working on putting a product together, and the coordination was there, the timing was there, but that's sometimes mistakes happen. And that's the nature of these projects. They're complicated, they're intricate, they have lots of other parts inside of them. And so what you end up happening is someone needs to look at it. Someone needs to experience the entire thing. They need to take the entire course, get perfect score, and get a failing score. Because if they don't see what the wrong error messages are, they won't see what the right error messages are. So complicated slightly, but really just a few hours of commitment. And then you also have to go back to your team and say, okay, fix these things. Here's the change report. Here's your change log. Go in here and update that. So I sped through this a little quickly. I had a lot of content to cover, so I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. I'm going to wrap up here, and then I'm going to go back into the session so we can see the questions if there are any, and there's a questions area to ask questions, and we'll address them. But before we do that, let's wrap up with our favorite topic, COVID-19. Well, one thing that's going to happen is voice artists are going to get sick, and I don't just mean by COVID-19, but in general, they do get sick, or they have other engagements, or they can only speak so long, or they can't get to the studio, or the studio has been shut down, or there's some other transport issue, or they don't have a studio at home. Again, voiceover artists are picky and tricky because you can't just replace people, meaning you do a casting, you find the person who's perfect for that part, a middle-aged man with middle American accent, that's who you want talking to this. And then you find the person, they're perfect, and then something happens and they can't do it. That's kind of bad because you don't have the recording available. The second thing is that we look at is also the internet. It's not so bad now, but it has been historically during the crisis and the pandemic that Netflix and Amazon have reduced their capacity in Europe and elsewhere because so many people are online. I have a team in Egypt who was telling me we work fine until it becomes late at night and everyone comes home and has nothing to do, so they all turn on Netflix, so they can't work or their speed is reduced. I've had teams in India who can't download massive files or work remotely on their remote systems because of the saturation of the internet and the quality of their connection. So that's something to be aware of. And the other thing that happens is in any case in any world of business disruption, what's going to happen is either people are going to say, hurry up, I need to get this out before this happens. There's a rush projects, and they're become very important to people, usually around messaging about the virus, or not always, but sometimes. Or the opposite happens. They just stop. They say, I can't do this. My conference has been canceled. My product release has been shelved, or whatever it is that causes things that are in process or booked, stop. And then the lighter version of that is they just hey, hold on. For example, Local Berlin is now an online one. The localization conference gala is now in September. So things get moved off a little, and that's okay. But it's just good to know that we're going to have some moving parts here that aren't just the complex projects with all those teams and all those component pieces. It's also the schedule and the funding and whatever other environmental factors are driving that business decision or that need for this to happen. So just add that to the mix. In conclusion, e-learning is really the future. It's more about how to navigate that complexity. Is something that everyone's going to have to develop a skill and learn how to do it. It's technical, yes. It's complicated, potentially. And this is the journey that both language service providers, freelancers, and content developers are going to have to develop. I mean, they already kind of know these things, but it's just coming up to the forefront. Working more in the engineering side, more on the technical side, either be it reverse engineering or more specifications or project understandings is important. And this is going to be very useful to you, but don't become dependent on engineering solved it all for me. They're still going to have some surprises because the way these things are built, surprises happen. And again, we're going to be looking at this more in the future. It was already be 10% over year. It's probably, I'm not going to speculate here, but probably 15 to 20%. And it's going to continue. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to go back to the session here, and hopefully we have a chat. Okay, I'm going to look at the questions. So I'm going to look at the first question here. We have 9. And if anyone has any comments, I can read the chat too as it comes in. As for articulate, what about the other right to left languages is Hebrew? So articulate handles Hebrew as badly as Arabic, meaning in Rise. In Storyline, it handles it fairly well. We've done a lot of Arabic and Hebrew in Storyline, and it works very well. The other languages like bidirectional or up and down, like Chinese or Japanese, those work as well. So that works. The next question is what tool technologies are relevant to work with e-learning? Actually, they're pretty good. The tools are in general just your basic cat tool, which is what you already might know. Like Smartcat, it has left or English on one side, target on the other. The tags and all that's the same. What's a little different and interesting is get a good practice for capturing defects. Like if I have an interaction that doesn't click when I click it, how do you do that? How do you describe that? And it's usually kind of like on the software side. I don't know if anyone here has done software QA, but when you do software QA, it says, when I do this, this does not happen. And you state it as a who you are, what you're trying to do, and what happens or what doesn't happen. And that's generally a good way to say it. And you can also be prescriptive in the sense that, for example, we have Japanese feedback about bad audio. And it says blah, it should say blah. That's how you do it. Because we don't read Japanese, but if you tell us replace this one with this one, we'll do it every day. Can you comment on free cat tools to practice from home? Sure, that one's a give me. That's Smartcat. That's actually probably the easiest one to get into in the sense it's online and you can use it. MemoQ is also free. There's a free license to MemoQ. That's another cat tool you can work on. Other cat tools, STL's Trados, and that tool set is free for 30 days, I believe. So you can download it and get started. There's a couple others that are open source, which you can use, but I would steer away from those. There's a Omega T, and I'm trying to remember the other ones. But those are the ones you just probably want to work with MemoQ and Smartcat, just because they're always going to be free for you. When we say someone needs to be QA, who should do it? Translator, the LSP, or for the client end? The answer is yes to all of the above. The way we work on QA is ideally the person who translated it is the one reviewing it because they had the first pass. So let's say we're doing something from English into Japanese, and my Japanese translator already tried, or at least worked good enough to research what they were saying, and now they're seeing it in context. So now they know, oh, when you were talking about part assemblies, you meant this. Oh, I translated it like that. And then they'll see the picture, and it's a different type of thing than they thought it was. they're going to be the best ones to catch that. Now, having a client QA it is also good. Typically, what I would recommend is if you're doing audio recordings or multimedia or things that are kind of process heavy, meaning you have a translation and then you go into production and a post-production cycle, try to get your translations reviewed by your client experts, because they're the ones who will know, hey, this subject matter is this, not that. And they're going to catch those before you get into the video booth or any of that other complicated stuff. So there's room for both, but the translator is probably the best choice for the QA. Is it important to record in a studio with top voiceover or home in a quiet room? Well, I'm in a quiet room. It's kind of okay. In my experience, the best is obviously the best. A studio with a monitor and a recording engineer or sound studio engineer who knows exactly what they're doing. They can say, hey, you need to lower that down, or you're going too fast, or whatever direction they have. That's the best. However, in a lot of cases, this audio is good enough. Meaning good enough because it's suitable for purpose, it's an internal training, or it's the quality is good. And then I've also had in-studio recording artists who just have a studio. They've invested the money, they have the soundproofing, they have the expensive equipment, and it sounds great. So in a way, you can't always just say anything else, but smartphone, probably not. I would use a USB headset at the minimum. USB works better than the DC connectors. That's really what you want to look for. Let's see here. Oh, I see. Jeff's asking here, if a studio but has a tiny budget, how do you manage that expectation? There's a couple ways you can do that. One is TTS. It's actually really cheap. It's just someone typing it in. The problem is the quality is not so good. The other one is you can do other things that with TTS is maybe not so good. You still want a human voice. There's places like voices.com or other places where you can get a marketplace of, I would say, freelance voice artists. But again, this is all your mileage may vary. So really, it's tricky to say that you want to have one solution for everything. Definitely not a smartphone, though. That's just never going to be good enough audio. The next item is on Smartcat subtitle. SRT will be required or needed to check the timing. Yes, the subtitle SRT can be uploaded, and it does take the timings from the file. I would highly recommend, though, that you probably process your SRTs yourself, meaning timings for English or Portuguese or French are all going to be different for the same section of time. So having a studio do the SRT properly, I guess that's air quotes on properly, but having a studio do the timing is going to give you a better result. And you can change the timing around, and that's probably post-production, because you want to translate and then say, oh, this should be at this second, not that second. And that's kind of more of a second pass. Let's see here. How does Poly perform in non-English languages? Yeah, for Hindi, it is kind of touch and go. Same thing for Arabic and other languages, and not just Poly. I mean, you have Google. Google has their neural wave nets. IBM has a few languages, and we have other availabilities. Microsoft has a bunch of languages. Does it perform in non-English pretty well? Let's just say it's biased towards English. Spanish is pretty good. I speak Spanish. The Mexican Spanish sounds all right. Some people will just always say by default, sounds like junk. They don't like it. So in a way, you end up with this pretty much love it or hate it. And then if you can live with it, then we can start talking about it. Think of it like margarine or something. Some people like it, some people can't touch it. For LSPs to be able to translate content from audio and video, but integrate back to audio video. So it's important that you're familiar with the process. Just like anything, you want to have a good partner of a studio if you're getting beyond your reach. There's some people do really good 3D animation, and you may never need that. So are you going to build up that resource and have a person sitting there who can do all that and then never get a job for it? So from an economic sense, it doesn't always make sense. So freelancers make a lot of sense for that. But if you get a lot of work in doing a certain type of thing, then yeah, it's worth investing into it. But always be available and have a studio partner or someone you can work with reliably. Which tools work good for Indian languages, Hindi and Tamil? It's going to be, again, your mileage will vary. If you're looking at tools for translation, there's obviously a bunch out there. For TTS, there's Poly, which is okay. Actually, going back to Poly and Hindi, it speaks English. It's bilingual, meaning if you have English and Hindi together, as is common sometimes, it'll actually switch between the two and not, well, screw both up, but not screw them terribly up. But it can basically switch between speaking English and Hindi within the same sentence, which is common. So that's worth looking at if it fits your use case. And what do I recommend for a good headset? I'm actually partial to Turtle Beach. This is a fancy gamer headset that I got. They're usually worth $100, but any headset with a USB is good. As long as you have a good USB headset and it's relatively good, you're fine to go. And you can get them cheaper. You can get them used. I wouldn't do it though because personal stuff. So again, just look around. But a USB headset in general, even a simple Logitech USB headset, is above and beyond better than anything on a laptop or anything else. So I think, let's see here. One last item, and I think we're almost done. For voice text expansion for subtitles, is it common to have longer modules, videos, locales? Yes, it's very common. So we're being asked about subtitles and text expansion. It's just like what happens in a text box. You only have so much space. And the shorter the phrase, the longer the expansion. The other thing to keep in mind is most translators can be instructed to keep it short. There's some grammar shortcuts you can make because you're speaking. So, it's not as rigid as written text. So articles might be able to drop off or, concatenate little things, make it smaller. That's really the choice of everyone, is to make your translations shorter. And that's tricky because how do you do that? And it becomes into, well, how long is the English? Well, I have 10 minutes to say this, or 5 minutes, or 2 seconds. This is a 2-second phrase in English. How long is it going to be in German? And the answer is, well, it's going to be 8 seconds. Okay, how do we negotiate that? And really just planning out ahead really helps you. There's some other tricks where you can play with a video and extend it. If it's not a person talking, or if it's a lot of videos have like a background shot of something. If you can loop it for another quarter second, nobody will notice. So tricks like that help. There's the other stuff, that pitch shift or pitch bending to squeeze audio into smaller places, but that's limited as well. So it is common to have longer than expected, but if you know this coming in and you tell your translators keep it short, you typically can be okay. And the funny thing is, I've done this in the past, where TTS can be used to model the audio at a regular speaking rate and say, okay, you gave me 13 seconds to talk in 8. Now we have a problem. And you can even do that if you don't understand how long that audio is going to be. And you can address it at the text level before it gets to anyone's voice. So I think, the transcription, yep, Happy Scribe is what I talked about. And I believe, everyone, we are done. If anyone has any questions about this in general, again, you can reach out to me. My email here is gilberts@Global eLearning. It'll be in this webinar. We're going to basically have it released afterwards, a recording. And, just keep up with Smartcat. I think the Slack channel from Loc from Home is still up. And let's see on anything. If you guys have any questions, again, we'll keep in touch. And I'll thanks for putting that in there, Smartcat. All right, everybody. Thanks again, and stay safe and have a wonderful evening or rest of day or start of day.